Ever wondered whether being a major in history in college would prepare you to deal with life's challenges? I'm Dr. Frank Douglas, the host of Antifragility Reframe podcast, where struggles become strength and stress fuels growth. My guest today is Dr. Jodi Vandenberg-Daves. She's a historian, an author, a mentor, and a coach. And in today's episode, we are going to explore her transformation from being an academic professor, feeling boxed in her area of history, and moving and pivoting to becoming a translational, relational, and inclusive leader. Dr. Vandenberg Daves, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I really love your mission, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Thank you very much. Well, could you share with us your journey to becoming a history professor and a little bit of some of the pivots that you made? What was the stress and the challenge that caused you to think of pivoting?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Becoming a history professor definitely was part of my youthful dreams. I first kind of fell in love with history in the college classroom, watching my professors just unspool these kind of panoramas of what history has meant and being able to see my parents' generation and myself and activists in history, that was really important to me, and seeing the connections between history and social justice and just being intellectually fascinated. So I pursued a PhD in history and have no regrets. It's a field that you could spend forever looking at. Moving then into the profession of being a historian, that was a little bit of a bumpy road. I did a sidestep into nonprofit work. And loved that. It was history related. It was I was assistant director of National History Day, but part of that pivot was I wasn't clear that I was going to be able to get a job in my field, and that took a little while. And so I did the National History Day thing where I learned some nonprofit management. I actually wrote some history curriculum for kids that later became something I wrote. My first book was really about empowering kids in grades 6 through 12 to be historians and participate in the National History Day program through, which is like a science fair for history. So, but when I then landed my first tenure track position, um, I was thrilled to be able to be doing, work in my field and to be kind of having a more clear assignment because when you're looking for work, you feel like you have to be all things to all people. And so for a while, the path was really good for me. I did end up branching out a bit from the focus on undergraduate teaching into leading large federal grants for history teachers, and that was exciting and fun to me, and I wanted to do it. Um, I will say that it caused friction. My work assignment caused some friction within the department I was working in, and after a while, it felt like it was no longer a friendly place for me to be doing my work, and I ended up transitioning kind of out of necessity into a different department, which at the time was called Women's Studies. And so that was my first kind of move away from the identity of fully of being a history professor. I guess those are my first two moves away because I did that kind of community outreach piece and I did the pivot into a different department. And I think when I look back at the whole trajectory of my life, it all kind of makes sense that I need pivots and I need fresh challenges. And sometimes I bump up against structures where it's like I can't be doing my work that I need to do, so I need to sort of change my context. And I can say more. That just takes me to that just takes me to about 2007. So you tell me what else you'd like to know.
No, that's really very interesting. I was just making myself a note as you talked about the stress that you were experiencing.
Hmm.
And so often when we talk about anti-fragility and people are facing disruptions in their work life, we say to them, look at the disruption as an opportunity to look at new directions because every disruption, every change is the beginning of a new reframe.
That's right. That's right. And at that time, it was the first time I sought out a little bit of career coaching, and I looked for people to help me with that reframe. And I also really leaned into my support. Particularly, my husband was just so clearly in my corner, and when I would doubt myself in the situation where people were not being friendly and I was feeling marginalized, he was always just anchoring me in my worth and that was really helpful in that pivot too. And then there were people on campus who reached out and sort of pulled me into this department where I was already an affiliate faculty. I was already, doing service and working with these folks. But I drew on existing relationships and expanded my toolkit in terms of people who could give me perspective. And that's part of how I navigated that transition, which was a difficult transition. That was one where I felt less in control. Even the approval to move departments was really not in my hands. It was in the hands of a dean, and I had to deal with those feelings of powerlessness. And I do remember feeling, saying to myself, I'm going to see this as part of my story. I mean, every story has really difficult chapters. I'm going to envision some kind of positive outcome. I'm not saying that worked all the time, you know, but it really was part of my effort to reframe is to try not to catastrophize, to try to envision this as a story that makes when you have big challenges in your story, that can really add to the richness of your understanding of humans and of life.
Yeah. No, that is wonderful. I mean, there's so many of the things that you are touching on that we talk about in Anti-Fragility Reframe. One of them you talked about and gave examples is, expanding the access, including others in your journey. And because that's where you find allies. And so often when we are faced with a stressful situation, we sort of hunker down and feel that we're the only ones experiencing it, or we become a little bit ashamed to let others know that we're actually facing a challenge. And so to have a supportive husband is just wonderful. No, that's just fantastic. And kudos to him. That is really fantastic. Tell me though, what are some of the things that in your present um, focus of mentoring and coaching that you bring to that from being a historian?
Well, maybe it's the focus on stories and story collecting, and trying to honor people's stories. So yes, I am a career coach and a speaker, but I'm still a researcher too. And although my latest book is more in the business and advice kind of category, it still draws on my historian sensibility. For one thing, I'm very sensitive to context, whether that's the historical context and the historical moment, the experiences that shaped people generationally. And, we have like 4 generations in the workforce, sometimes 5 still. So all have different generational experiences. And then I think it's that attention to story and the change and continuity in people's lives. That change, that continuity is sometimes that just who we fundamentally are, what our values are, what our passions are, and what we want to be doing. And the change is something that needs to be honored. That um, we outgrow situations, that's part of life. So I think in my coaching and in bringing this latest book into the world, which is a kind of about the career journey and bringing your values to it, there's always a historian in me, there's always that sensibility.
And one of the things you mentioned to me was the importance of relation.
Hmm.
Comment on that.
But when I moved, as time went on, I became more interested in and attracted to the power of building relationships with people in kind of smaller settings. I still, taught in large classrooms and things like that, but I focused more of my attention on relationship building, both with my students to the extent that was possible. Sometimes I had just too many in a semester, right? But with my students, but also with my colleagues and collaborations I did, and including working with K-12 teachers on the history grants. And I found there's that depth of kind of mutual empowerment that comes with relationships. And then I also really leaned on the sort of fundamental relational orientation I have as I moved into leadership roles, whether that was leading these history grants, which encompassed many school districts across a couple of different states, people I didn't see and run into. I had to develop, a lot of communication skills around that. But then as I later became a department chair, of the department that was when I began chairing it, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And then we had a merger with Ethnic and Racial Studies. And in my last year chairing the department, I oversaw the merger of these two departments with, strong sense of identity and values, and people who'd kind of been through a lot of transitions and had been through COVID. We're still kind of in COVID. And so leaning on those relational skills was absolutely key to developing my leadership, the leadership skills that allow me now to help develop other leaders who go through challenging situations. And I encourage them to lean on their strengths and lean on their relational skills. I do believe leaders always need to balance task orientation and relationship orientation. We have all these tasks to get done. We have all this work to get done. But if we're not attending to relationships, people can feel sidelined, conflicts can emerge. We are maybe not leveraging people's strengths enough. All these kinds of things can happen if we lose track of that importance of relationships first and people first.
We like to think about the difference between being resilient, which is very important. Resilient helps us to bounce back from stress.
Hmm.
Being anti-fragile helps us to bounce forward when we have stress. And you have done a lot of bouncing forward. And a couple of sentences, or share with us a couple of principles, if you like, that are on this journey that have become important to you.
Well, I think listening, learning, and cultural humility is really important. Humility about situations that you don't know and haven't experienced, especially if you have different kinds of privilege. In my case, for example, white privilege or cisgender privilege, able-bodied privilege. There's a lot of different privileges I have. And I try to operate with humility and I understand and believe that people who've been othered or marginalized in the workplace or in other situations in life who've faced those challenging experiences of struggling to belong in systems that weren't designed for them, people who experience that tend to bring what I call superpowers. Like, and the research really, I think, bears a lot of that out, that there are strengths that you gain from having those experiences. You learn context awareness, you learn emotional agility, you may be asking disruptive questions that need to be asked. And so, operating from that principle that people who have often been overlooked for leadership often have these amazing strengths and superpowers. That includes women in general, often, although it depends on anybody can be kind of socialized into traditional leadership and can leave that behind. Anybody can, right? But some people use their kind of difficult experiences to grow their compassion and their understanding for others and to really be great advocates for more inclusive spaces where people can create that psychological safety and innovate and give their contributions and connect with others. So I guess cultural humility and recognizing those superpowers and recognizing other people's leadership